The century of reason, science, and enlightenment is also the century that witnessed the worst massacres ever seen due to conflicts between men. Despised by many as the symbol of communist evil, admired by others as a major 20th century Russian statesman, Stalin and his men conducted a large-scale effort to neutralize internal enemies and dissidents within the Socialist Party and the armed forces, convinced by the premise that by purging the party would be strengthened. After this process, which marked a milestone in Russia, the government of Vladimir Lenin and the original Bolsheviks was practically unrecognizable compared to Stalin's government, with new men and new procedures, described by Trotsky as conservative and counter-revolutionary. Among millions persecuted, some authors say, or hundreds of thousands, according to historians who argue the West exaggerated the numbers. The truth is that despite the image of a paranoid and desperate Stalin, after this turbulent purge, the Soviet leader actually consolidated his absolute command and the armed peace in the Soviet Union until the day of his death. What were the alleged causes of this phenomenon, and how did this unprecedented story unfold? This is Rinaldo Carrillo speaking, and today I want to extend a big invitation for you to follow us on our new channel, Mysteries of History, where I'll narrate videos on a wide range of fascinating topics for you. I'm sure you're going to love it. The link will appear here on the screen, so you can check out what we've published, so you can join, subscribe, and learn as much and enjoy it as much as we do. Without further ado, let's start with today's story. In the middle of the decade after the rise of the Soviet Union, built on the foundations of the Russian Empire and following the sudden death of Vladimir Lenin, the Politburo's top officials were now responsible for rebuilding the political and economic systems devastated by the Russian Civil War, and at the same time to appoint the next leader who would guide the fate of the Soviet state. The end of the Russian Civil War was far from meaning true peace. Internal enemies from the White Army, internal dissidents from the Communist Party, and agents of the Western powers were still present in the Soviet Union with the goal of removing the Soviet leadership. Just as the Soviets had expansionist ambitions, they also had serious reports, even of possible invasions of their territory by the Western powers. For this role as Soviet Union leader, numerous prominent figures with significant careers within the revolution emerged as candidates, such as Leon Trotsky, Georgy Pyatakov, Grigory Zinoviev, Nikolai Bukharin, Lev Kamenev, and Joseph Stalin. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was not the unified bloc many believe. Although the socialist ideal was indeed dominant, uncertainty and differences between personalities created an atmosphere of rivalry. They sought to build communism, but there was no consensus on the methods or the leadership to achieve that goal. For the communists, like all the other revolutionaries of the time, liberals, nationalists, Republicans, among others, the cause had to be defended at all costs and by any means necessary. They were men who were still willing to give or take life if necessary. The greatest example of this internal rivalry within the Communist Party was exemplified by the conflict between Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky had just built the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. He supported the concept of permanent revolution. In other words, Bolshevism's internationalization and replacing national borders with a global proletarian union. On the other hand, Stalin and Bukharin defended socialism in one country, focusing on the defense of socialism within national borders, under a patriotic banner, and using the same force as a method of imperial influence in the rest of geopolitics. After gathering solid support within the party, with the help of Sergei Kirov, Joseph Stalin in 1924 formed a triumvirate together with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Stalin led what some have called the right wing of the Communist Party to fight with this triumvirate against the so-called left wing, headed by Trotsky and Pyatakov. After years of marginalization, he finally challenges many close to Trotsky. Stalin wins the struggle, forcing Leon Trotsky into exile in 1929. Shortly after, following the internal struggle within the triumvirate, Stalin finally emerges as the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, initiating a profound process of industrialization, economic reorganization, and governmental centralization. Years later, as we will see later on, Trotsky later criticized Stalin's government as very different from Lenin's, noting that conservative figures had joined Stalin's administration. Even former Tsarist officers, whom Trotsky considered counter-revolutionary and reactionary, had joined, and according to Trotsky, only a handful of the original Bolshevik revolutionaries remained. Stalin's new government thus found itself surrounded by strong opposition from the very beginning. In early 1932, the effects of sudden agricultural collectivization, some famines that broke out for various reasons, and the displacement of many landowners and peasants from their lands led to uprisings by some groups against the government and sabotage in industrial centers. These problems, along with the personalities within the party who naturally sought to seize power, caused sectors of the Communist Party and the Red Army to start working against Stalin. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev being part of the triumvirate that took power and exiled Trotsky from the Soviet Union. They remained enthusiastic about Stalin, his economic plans, and party leadership. However, it wasn't ruled out that they might use this uncertainty to their advantage and turn against Stalin. For his part, Leon Trotsky, before and after his exile since 1929, mobilized all his efforts to oppose Stalin internally in Russia and to oppose him internationally, creating alternative communist parties in other countries against Stalinism. Amid all this, the 30s were also tumultuous in Europe. Tensions were rising that signaled a new war. The actions of the British Empire and the rise of National Socialism to power in Germany alerted the high-ranking officials of the Soviet Union, who saw a major military conflict coming, and who would also seek to take advantage of this conflict for their geopolitical goals. It was normal for German, British, or American agents to infiltrate the Soviet Union, in addition to the internal threat posed by dissent within the party during wartime. Faced with this situation, the Soviet leaders concluded that it was necessary to take drastic measures to maintain unity of command in the Soviet Union in the face of the coming war and economic chaos. This distrust of the outside powers seeking war toward internal party dissidents who tried to remove Stalin and internal enemies still aiming to overthrow the Soviet Republic. Struggles occurred at every political level in an empire with over 100 million people. It finally erupted on December 1, 1934, with the murder of Sergei Kirov, a very important man who was very close to Stalin's government. This key event would, over a year later, trigger the so-called Moscow trials, which for many historians are considered the formal beginning of the so-called Great Purge of Stalin. In 1936, after Sergei Kirov's murder, investigations began and suspicions arose. The state issued its official version in the so-called First Trial of the 16 in August 1936. There, 16 members of the so-called Trotsky-Zinoviev Center would be accused. They were all former Bolsheviks and loyal revolutionaries, none other than former members of the triumvirate, at the top of the party hierarchy. Like Sergei, Zinoviev and Kamenev were accused of plotting Sergei Kirov's assassination and planning an attempt on Stalin. In this way, the accused were sentenced to death. Meanwhile, the Politburo provided lists and clear instructions to the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs Secret Police, initially led by Genrikh Yagoda and later by Nikolai Yezhov, so that they would begin a systematic process of capturing all those suspected of treason and disloyalty who were considered a threat to the party. The level of internal power that this secret police concentrated within the Russian state was practically undisputed. And it was through this organization that the massive purge raids were organized. It is worth noting that the term purge was originally used only to refer to the mass expulsions of members of the Communist Party. But the new leadership would adopt procedures not only of expulsion, but also of persecution and violence against those who were considered enemies of the people. So with this trial of the 16 begins what lasted for more than 2 years, between 1936 and 1938, a process of mass imprisonment of people throughout the Soviet Union, either to send them to prison, to send them into exile, to send them to prison camps, or to directly end their lives. Under this term, many criminals of various kinds were arrested, but especially people connected to politics and the military world, from the lowest to the highest ranks, sometimes direct conspirators against the leadership of the Communist Party, and other times simply innocent people. Many of the most important Bolsheviks since the October Revolution and Vladimir Lenin's government were punished by Stalin. Of the 6 Politburo members present after Lenin's death, the Politburo being the most powerful body, this gives a good idea. Only 3 members of these 6 top leaders survived the purges, including Joseph Stalin himself. During this process, the government also targeted landowners, demographic minorities, and religious leaders, as well as socialist agents, anarchists, separatists, and former members of the White Army, who fervently encouraged internal conflict and the disintegration of Russia into several separate parts. After the trial of the 16 in 1936, in January 1937, the trial of the 17 was held, where some mid and high-ranking members were tried. Standing out among all of them was Georgy Pyatakov, one of the most important figures of the Trotskyist left wing of the Communist Party. The guilty were sentenced to death and others were sent to prison camps. In June of that same year, 1937, the case of the anti-Soviet Trotskyist military organization was organized, a military-level trial hidden from the public eye. By September 1938, the repercussions were the expulsion of up to a total of 37,700 officers and commissars from the Red Army, of whom 10,800 were detained and 7,200 were sentenced to death for crimes of treason. This, among other reasons, was to ensure unified military command amid current threats and looming war. Finally, a third trial took place in March 1938, where 21 high-ranking people were tried for allegedly being members of a group that brought together the right wing and the Trotskyist agents led by Nikolai Bukharin. Among the accused in this trial was, ironically, the relentless Genrikh Yagoda, who paradoxically had been leading the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs and the purges until April 1937. Yagoda oversaw the arrest and execution of all previously sentenced individuals, and now it was his turn, as all those involved in this trial were also executed. According to historian James Harris, the purge, far from being the result of Stalin's personal cruelty, it was a matter of self-preservation by a very violent and weakened Soviet structure. It was a party that was convinced of its mission to establish communism on Earth, which felt threatened. And in fact, it was threatened from the West, while internally it had anti-Soviet elements, as well as internal party dissidents. This purge was a form of persecution practiced since Lenin and the October Revolution. At the same time, the constant threat of a new war breaking out in Europe kept the Russian state on alert. However, the Soviet Union still collaborated with National Socialist Germany by signing the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. In an act known as the Purge of the Refugees, dozens of German and Austrian communists who were in Russian territory were handed over to the German National Socialist authorities. Like them, many non-Slavic members of the International Socialists were exterminated without trial while they were refugees, due to suspicions by the secret police that they were spies. Many other Soviet citizens who disobeyed orders to return to their country to be interrogated by the authorities suffered the same fate, and who, due to suspicion, were secretly executed abroad by the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. It wasn't until the end of 1938, faced with the excesses that these purges, led by Nikolai Yezhov, were taking, and once the work of eliminating the dissent had been completed, Stalin ordered the end of the purges. That year, he made Lavrentiy Beria the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs his new director. Lavrentiy Beria then focused on pursuing, imprisoning, and executing People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs members, who had earlier done the same to thousands during the purges. Nikolai Yezhov, who had taken over as director of the secret police after the previous director was executed, was also captured and sentenced to death. After dismantling the police apparatus, Lavrentiy Beria's leadership acknowledged the secret police's excesses under Yagoda and Yezhov. The Great Purge was more complex than some historiography suggests, which often reduces it to just Stalin's psychopathology or personal evil. The Purge involved different actors and levels of persecution in a nation that really had not yet emerged from a state of internal and external war. Some saw the Great Purge as a conflict over the very existence of Russia. In turn, there are discrepancies about the total and actual figures of this process. Some of the most famous figures in the West have been later debunked. For example, Conquest states in his well-known book, The Great Terror, that by 1939, about 9 million people were imprisoned, as well as the archipelago. Gulag by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, published during the Perestroika period, claimed that the Soviet regime had more than 66.7 million victims. In response to this, historians like Roy Medvedev, Arseny Roginsky, and Viktor Semskov, who were not Stalinists but sought to establish the most rigorous truth, pointed out that the numbers were considerably lower than what had long been believed. Using declassified People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs and KGB archives, along with Soviet Union annual censuses, the former director of the KGB, Vladimir Khrushchev, stated that between 1930 and 1953, 3.8 million people were imprisoned, and 780,000 were sentenced to death. This period is much longer than the 2 years of the Great Purge. Trotsky was another important opinion leader against Stalin, whom the West adopted as a kind of good left against Stalin's bad left. Although Trotsky survived the 2 years of the Great Purge, it eventually caught up with him, as he couldn't escape the vengeance of the old guard. Bolshevik, who was now loyal to Stalinism and was considered an intellectual serving foreign Western interests. With Trotsky's life ended on August 21st, 1940 in Mexico City by a Spanish agent of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Like the myth of Kronos, the Soviet Revolution, embodied in its machinery, devoured its children to protect itself. This was not the first time this happened, either in the Soviet government with Lenin or in other regimes throughout history. However, the circumstances and the magnitude of this process sealed it in the collective imagination of our contemporary history. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and invite you to subscribe to our new channel, Mysteries of History. We will publish unique, exclusive, and engaging content on a wide range of historical topics. Below, in the description and in the comments, you'll be able to find the link so you can join and check out what we've published. Please remember to leave your comments on this video. Like the video, turn on the notification bell, and follow us on our Instagram account called La Nueva Enciclopedia. That's all. Goodbye and God bless you all.